everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
Once you can measure it, you can actually start to then use technology to induce rewiring in the brain to actually cause it to behave differently. And that's got a broad range of applicability, both for treating medical diseases and also for helping augment human performance to obliterate things like anxiety and depression and to actually get people to perform, to experience cognitive function at a higher level.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Dr. David Bach, founder and CEO of Optios. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you so much.
So, David, there are a lot of self-help books that talk about this notion of fear of success. And sometimes that our greatest obstacle to success is really us. I wonder if you had any thoughts.
Well, I think that I believe that so firmly it probably forms the basis of my life, both from a professional and a personal point of view. My own sense, Scott, is that how we look at the world, the mental state that we adopt, foundationally changes the nature of our experience and what we create there. And so, yes, I'm a firm believer in that, and B, I've committed myself professionally to trying to see if I can contribute to the technological capability to actually allow the mind to be better, and thus your life experience and performance to be better.
Super, great. And we'll get into that, deconstruct that in just a few minutes here. So David, you talk about a point in your life where it was a catalyst for applying some of this empirical science to better understanding your subconscious mind as well as your behavior that you kind of referenced. If you could first tell us the role that our neural connections have in our thoughts and behavior, and maybe also define what is neurotechnology, and how does some of these kind of past neural connections, both known and unknown, affect the way we behave and sometimes just get in the way of our own success?
Let me start and talk about this notion of what we know about the brain and how it ties to our sense of ourself. We all have a brain. It's a 3-pound organ. It's got 100 billion cells, 10,000 connections per cell to other cells. It's a very complex organism. One of the insights that's come out of the neuroscience world, let's say in the last 15 years or so, is the power of what we can call unconscious parts of the brain. And when I say unconscious, I mean things that are happening in the brain around which kind of who we think of as ourselves is not aware. Stuff that's just kind of happening in the background. And, an example of that is when you go and you take a drive, you can sometimes go 30 minutes, have no memory of what's happened. And what's going on is that there are pathways, which just basically mean connections of neurons, operating below the surface, governing our activities. And I think people have, since the time of Freud and maybe even before, known that stuff happens that we're not aware of. But perhaps the breakthrough in the neuroscience world is the discovery of how incredibly powerful those unconscious pathways, connections are in governing our behavior. And the flip side of that, or let's say the complement to that, is we also know that the brain is very plastic. It can rewire itself. And so using neuroscience, neurotechnology, increasingly we are learning how to actually craft the pathways in the unconscious parts of the brain. And with that, who you are in the world, how you experience life can change without you having any awareness of what's actually happened. And so now diving into this question that you asked about, well, what is neurotechnology? The name is pretty obvious. It's technology which is based on neuroscience, and it involves a whole host of capabilities that increasingly are allowing us to A, measure what's happening in the brain, and then B, influence it, partly by tapping into the brain's neuroplastic ability. And so let me begin and talk about measuring what's happening in the brain. During the last 10 years, there have been a number of breakthroughs. I'm sure you're aware of many of them in imaging for the brain. So we can now look inside your brain with 1,000 times more specificity than we could 10 years ago. And with that, you can start to use machine learning to build correlations between what you see in the brain and the real world, and map out, okay, this is what your brain looks like when you're in the zone. This is what your brain looks like when you're asleep. This is what your brain looks like when you're experiencing intense anxiety. And once you do that, once you can measure it, you can actually start to then use technology to induce rewiring in the brain to actually cause it to behave differently. And that's got a broad range of applicability, both for treating medical diseases and also for helping augment human performance, to obliterate things like anxiety and depression, and to actually get people to perform, to experience cognitive function at a higher level.
And of course, behind everything you're sharing, there is incredible, immense amount of research and body of work that's there. So to translate this in a more colloquial fashion, it's a little bit more challenging. But specifically, you're talking about the use of electroencephalography, or EEG, that measures biosignals, that helps us to have a better understanding of these neural patterns that could shape attitudes, maybe beliefs, behavior, or thought patterns, or relaxation versus maybe cognitive load, for instance. Help us understand a little bit more, maybe a layer below, in terms of the way our brain works on a kind of unconscious or subconscious level. A lot of that is really just, our body function working in a kind of a passive state behind the scene. But you're talking about things that has to do with notion of fear, apprehension, depression, as an example, things that are more qualitative, softer.
Yeah. I want to try to be both, as you say, colloquial and precise in giving you an answer to this. It might help for me to tell you about a research experiment that was done 10 years ago that I think illustrates some of the answers you're seeking. And this was based on, again, 10-year-old technology, but still it was very powerful. So 10 years ago, DARPA, and for those listening who don't know what DARPA is, it stands for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they're kind of the sci-fi arm of the military. They funded, as Scott said, a great deal of research in trying to understand how you could use neuroscience to make warfighters better, because it's a branch of the military. And the experiment they did to start this off was a really simple but powerful one. They asked, can you use neuroscience technology to distinguish the brain of an expert from a novice? The task they picked was marksmanship, shooting a gun, because it's military, everybody's got to shoot a gun. It's very easy to say who's good or not. So they scanned the brains of 100 of the best snipers in the military, and then they compared those brains to novices. And what they discovered is that the expert brain knows how to get into a mental state that's called the zone. And people have known about the zone for decades, but what was powerful about this experiment is they were actually able to find a biological correlate. They could take a picture of the brain and say, that's what your brain looks like when you're in the zone. And then they showed with the novices, they didn't know how to get there. And then they went on and did something even more exciting. They said, well, now that we understand what expertise looks like in the brain, what this zone state looks like, can you use technology to train it, to actually get these novices' brains to rewire and learn to find this new pathway? And this speaks to the question you're asking about how you can influence this, Scott. And so they invented something called a neurofeedback device. It's basically a high-tech headband. It's got a bunch of sensors. It's measuring, is your brain in the zone or not? Then they attached it to a haptic motor. Very simple. So when you're not in the zone, it's buzzing on on the sniper's neck. When you get into the zone, the buzzing goes away. So neurofeedback. And what they've discovered is that it was incredibly effective. The novices, with a month of training, like 10 minutes a day, rewired their brain. Their brain learned to get to that state. And then in turn, that improved their shooting accuracy. So now zooming out and going to your question, what's happening in the neuroscience world is these types of correlation analyses are giving us an understanding of what's happening in the brain tied to what you would call these softer types of things. You're taking real world performance where you've got dependent variables. I make the shot, I don't make the shot. We're working with traders. I made a profitable trade or not. And then you build machine learning systems to say, can I figure out for an individual what a brain looks like when you're in the zone, when you're not, when you're stressed, when you're not. And with that, we're building a library of brain states which are highly accurate and ultimately going to be transformational, the same way that with a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, you can track things like the number of steps you take or your heart rate. Does that help, Scott?
So there's a lot of wearables that's been in the market or in development for, I would say, the last 10 plus years, including the one I'm holding up here, for example.
Yes.
That is really trying to not only measure, but also give feedback, exactly to your point. And it's helping us to be able to actually calibrate our ability in particularly measuring the alpha wave that has to do with the relaxed state associated with also our inhibition control. Now, I think in some of the materials that we looked at, you focus primarily on the alpha, but can you talk to us also about some of the other bands like theta and beta and the delta, and if those have anything to do with some of the retraining or reprogramming the plasticity of our neural connections?
Yes. So I think many people have heard of these frequency bands. Let me first talk about what they are and then talk about what they mean and also the limitations associated with them. So we know the brain is an electrical organ. I told you there's 100 billion cells. They talk to each other. They use electricity to talk. And so if one neuron wants to talk to another, it sends an electrical impulse to that neuron to send a message there. And so if you put a sensor on top of the head, you can see the amalgamated electrical signals and start to make sense. And what we know is that when you look at those electrical signals, the brain actually communicates in different frequency bands. And frequency is just a matter of how quickly the signals are going. And so alpha was a band between a certain speed. And then beta and theta, they're all different kind of speeds of these connections. And we know those different frequency bands are associated with different types of things. So as you say, alpha is more associated with relaxation and sleep. Beta is more associated with kind of awakeness. Theta is actually associated with deep meditation. In the old days, and when I say the old days, I mean 10 years ago, as much as 100 years ago, there was a sense that if you could monitor and give feedback around those frequency bands, it would be useful. If you can get more alpha activity, that's a good thing. For example, if you want to relax. What I think we've learned in the last 10 years is that the brain is a lot more complex than that. And just giving someone feedback saying, get more alpha, get more theta, get less of this, it's a very blunt instrument. And so the breakthrough that's occurred in the last 10 years is because of things like signal processing and machine learning, we can now get a much more detailed understanding of what's happening in the brain than just that. We can actually source localize and figure out not just is there alpha activity, but is there alpha activity in the amygdala? Is the amygdala talking to the prefrontal cortex and the like? And so you can imagine that the specificity with which we can identify a brain signature has increased somewhere around 1,000-fold in the last 10 years. With that, our ability to measure and give accurate feedback has improved. So the device you showed me is useful, but frankly, very primitive compared to what we can do today. And what we can do today is very primitive compared to what we'll be able to do a few years from now. And it is that precision, that ability to add more detail and depth around what you measure in the brain, which is actually creating the revolution in this industry. And so I'll tell you, those devices are great for some people. but they will be antiquities in a matter of years. They actually already are.
So let's talk about what is Optios and what are you looking to achieve through that? And specifically, I think the areas that we're interested in understanding is really the patented IP or the trade secrets specific to your approach that is, based on this larger body of work that's emerging.
Thank you for asking. So the vision for Optios is to build an operating system to power the emerging neuroperformance industry. And so what that means is we're trying to create a software platform that will allow us to decode brain signals and give you information about, let's say, 10 or 15 critical states of being, and then give you tools to actually rewire the brain to be able to get there. So I'll give you an example, and this is a vision. I'll talk to you in a moment about what we're doing today. But let's say it's 2-3 years from now and you're a student, you're preparing for the SAT, you'll be able to figure out, is your brain in a learning state or not? And we know scientifically, if it is, you'll absorb information 3 times as quickly as if it isn't. Now, if it isn't, then what you want to be able to do is basically push a button, induce a new state, and now you can absorb information more effectively. You can also use that data to inform the information that's coming to you to modulate it. And there's a lot of research showing that with that, you can essentially triple learning speed. Or let's say that you're an athlete, you're a golfer, you have trouble getting in the zone before you step up to hit a putt. What you would want to do is measure, am I in the zone before I hit it? Can I train my brain to get there? In a very similar way to what I told you about with snipers. So that's the vision. We started the company acquiring a body of intellectual property, around $300 million worth of patents and databases and the like, from the work that was originally funded from DARPA. And so, a broad array of capabilities. And then we said, look, we know we want to be the operating system long-term, but you can't boil the ocean. You need to start somewhere. So we said, let's find 1 or 2 verticals we can begin with that meet 3 criteria. Number 1, we want a vertical where the science is so solid, we know we can today move performance. 2, we wanted it to be a customer who's motivated, where they've got money, and if you can give them an edge, they'll pay for it. And finally, it's got to be useful for our brand. So the 2 areas we picked were financial trading and sports, because they met those 3 criteria. So just to give you a sense, in financial trading, we've now been doing 3 years of research monitoring the brainwaves of what are called proprietary traders. These are guys who work for hedge funds. They make 30, 40 trades a day, trading huge amounts of money, looking at their brainwaves while they trade. So we've got data on tens of thousands of hours of brainwaves, and meanwhile, over 150,000 transactions. And using machine learning, based on what I talked to you about before, we can now identify a brain signature in a trader, essentially a zone state, where when they're in that state, their trades tend to be profitable, and when they're not, they tend to lose money. So we've got 62% accuracy in predicting, based on brainwaves alone, will a trade make money or lose money? And I think you would agree, if you can actually go and predict which trades are going to make money or lose money with that type of accuracy, it's a multi-billion-dollar opportunity. But more broadly, it becomes the foundation for building something quite sizable around the ability to influence and have an impact on human functioning in a broad array of arenas. So we'll be expanding in the finance world. We have some very exciting stuff in sports, but over time, we intend to go into additional verticals and ultimately the consumer sector, driving, if we are able to realize our dream, the operating system of the entire industry with something we can license to people as they increasingly incorporate neuroscience in their products.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. My follow-up question, or twofold. One is from an R&D perspective, from a lab or data gathering, it makes a lot of sense to have certain sample size, those participants that are willing to wear the EEG head cap or headset to capture this information so you could start to feed your machine learning and neural net.
Wow.
However, in practical sense, to outfit an entire trading floor with EEG head caps may not be realistic. And same with basketball players or any type of professional sports, for example. So EEG has always had that issue because of the fact that it's just problematic. And of course, it's gotten a lot better in terms of wet versus dry form and the ability to actually have, better, stronger fidelity around signal processing, but that's still an issue. The other thing is, which still is a little bit vague to me, is the behavior modification. So it's one thing to understand what depicts that zone for that particular vertical use case, but how do you actually correct or train the brain in such a way to get into that zone?
Yeah, these are all excellent questions. So the first thing I'll say is it is not unrealistic to wire up an entire trading firm today. And the reason is the breakthroughs that have happened around the hardware. And so right now, the headset we're using, we don't make the headset, we're buying it. But this headset, it takes less than 2 minutes to put on. It weighs less than a pound. The traders don't notice it. And they're very motivated because the deal we have allows them to make more money with it. And so we have had absolutely no resistance. And I can tell you, in the sports world, if you've got an athlete, you're not going to wear it while you're playing a game. But if you believe this will give you an edge, you're a basketball player, you think you can improve your free throw average, or you think you can make your visual processing faster, there has not been an issue. I do agree, until you can make something which feels and looks like a Fitbit, you won't have a consumer product. But in places where people look for an edge, the technology is at a point where it's both affordable and usable enough that we're not getting any resistance from use. And so that's point number one. With regard to your question about, well, how do you give the feedback? One really nice thing about the trading world is we get to make money and our clients get to make money without doing any neurofeedback. If you know, for example, in advance when a trader makes a trade, if that trade is statistically likely to make money or lose money, you can actually build a system to increase the size of the trades when they're in a good brain state and decrease the size of the trades when they're in a bad brain state where it's completely algorithmic. The trader doesn't even know what's happening. They can benefit economically. But our initial data is suggesting you can triple the yield, triple the Sharpe ratio, triple the yield of a trader with something like that. And so there are these use cases where simply knowing the information can give you an edge. In the sports world, similarly, you can use this to screen players to say, who's more likely to be successful in my next roster, or who should I put onto the roster for today? But with that said, the question of how to give feedback is an area of tremendous research. And I think it's actually outside the scope of what we're talking about. But what I will say is the brain's a learning organ. And if you learn how to give someone positive reinforcement when they're in a good state and negative reinforcement when they're in a bad state, and you do it correctly, the brain will learn, it will rewire itself. It's well proven. And so it's a non-trivial exercise to do that. But I'm going to tell you, it is definitively the case. If I know what your brain looks like when you're in an optimal state and what it looks like when it's not, the industry can give you feedback so that it accelerates your learning curve toward being able to access that better state on a more consistent basis.
So one of the things that when it comes to Olympics or very elite athletics is this notion of, it's a mind game. So
yes.
Keeping all things, constant, most of the athletes at that level are going to be similar in capabilities. But when it comes to that final competition, that matchup, it's really those that have the nerves of steel, as they call it, that can stay in that zone. So I could see how this information could inform and working with other professionals, including those that help with meditation, maybe even muscle relaxation, chiropractic, all of these kind of, holistic team members. They can come in and help you to get into that zone so that you're not caught up in this situation. Now, the other thing is you're primarily looking at through the EEG, but I wonder what other vital data, heart rate variability, galvanic skin response, lots of other data could help inform when somebody is, let's say, for example, not breathing at full capacity because they're, stressed.
Yes.
Or their pupils are dilating, for example, whatever it is. How are you pulling in other modalities and data set to enrich your data so that it's even more statistically significant?
I want to answer that question on two levels. One is broadly, and then about us. I think what you're pointing to is where the industry is headed, and where technology is headed. And so it's pretty clear to me that, let's say 10 years from now, while you're sitting at a computer monitor while you're doing your work, all of those things are going to be gathered in real time without you having any awareness of it. They're going to be compiled to give you information about what's going on with you. So yeah, it's going to track where your pupils are, what's happening to your pupil size, galvanic skin response, heart rate variability, all of those things. And clearly, the more data you have, the more precise you can get in terms of giving people information. The research we are doing, the research the industry is doing, does involve all of those things. And so, yeah, with the traders, EEG is the primary source of data for us, but many of our studies, we've looked at all the things you're talking about. And so we've looked at pupils and pupil size and galvanic skin response and heart rate variability. And the more of those things you have, the more accurate your machine learning can be, and the better your ability to create technological solutions is. And so, yeah, that's clearly where things are headed. It's this world is a big data play for sure. But now the data is the data from your brain and body in terms of using that to predict, understand your behavior, and then give you feedback so that you become more of who you would like to be.
So let's talk briefly about privacy and from the perspective of both the surveillance, but also this notion of using that information for, like I said, screening. So given the context of we live in a post-COVID world where there's a lot of telecommuting or remote working, employers are, undoubtedly very curious about the productivity of their employees, and they're using lots of different ways to figure out if they're engaged and if they're productive. And certainly, even in a physical environment like a warehouse, there's already machine learning, vision computer that's looking to see how productive a worker is.
Yes.
If we can get down to the head space level, how does that potentially, maybe not only limit and filter, but also potentially, certain people could be at risk of being terminated, for example, because they can't get into the zone on a regular basis?
Yeah, I think you're bringing up a critical question, which is of societal importance and philosophically, a big question. I think over time, the kind of stuff we're doing could be, like many technologies, used for good or evil. And there is no doubt there are already a lot of laws in place which prevent discrimination based on, for example, health conditions. I would think that over time there will be a lot of regulations that come out regarding what people can use, who owns it. And so in the athletic world, increasingly athletes are saying, look, this is my data. You don't get to own this. I get to own it. I get to decide who gets access to it, who doesn't get access to it. If you want access to it, I get to generate the revenue stream from it. And I think that is going to happen. The good news, though, is that if used correctly, this kind of data and this kind of technology can benefit everybody. And so I think you're bringing up an incredibly important and gnarly issue. But as with all technology, it's not going to stop the growth of the field. It just has to be superimposed. And certainly what we've learned, from the disaster that social media has become, is that technology, when it's not properly controlled, can do huge damage in the world. And so I think it's an important question. In the neuroscience world, pretty much every major player is committed to, at least today, trying to do right. And so you see ethics committees, for example, at IEEE, where we have a representative, and every major neuroscience player has a representative, because we all understand it is incumbent on corporate America, with the power of this kind of technology, to do the best job you can to make sure what you do is going to have a net positive benefit on humanity. But I mean, it's a really important issue you raise. And yeah, our ability to read the brain is staggering, and it's just going to get better.
So for those that are listening that are still maybe trying to get their arms around this area of specialization that you guys are focusing on may have heard of others that are in the space that are maybe more on the hardware side as well as on the software side. So, for example, Brian Johnson's kernel that allows for humans to evolve alongside machines. Maybe I think they pivoted a number of times, but now they're looking to improve neurodegenerative disease such as epilepsy, to Neuralink's implantable brain-machine interface that's trying to connect to those thousands of neurons that you mentioned before, and being able to not only read those signals, but at some point translate those into movements and control of external devices.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that, and how should we think about Optios in the context of these broader momentums and technologies that's emerging?
As a starting point, the neurotechnology space is going to be huge, right? It's going to be like mobile phones, or it's going to be like computers. And so with that, there's room for a multitude of players, each, participating in a different part of the whole ecosystem. And so you're seeing that already as the field is beginning to emerge, that different companies are picking their lanes, and we're in a particular lane. One thing I will say, in looking at Silicon Valley and where people are pouring their money, most of the money is going into hardware with the belief that the long-term play is getting a Fitbit for the brain. And I'll tell you, our view is that that's an error. Our view is it's a very similar kind of thing to what happened 40 years ago when the PC industry started. And you may remember this. Everybody knew PCs were going to be huge. Everybody believed the form factor mattered. IBM came in and said, we're going to own the space. Now, at that time, they needed something called an operating system that no one had heard about. So they call up this guy named Bill Gates, who's no one's heard of, just a few employees, say, will you build us an operating system? And in this very famous deal, he said, yeah, sure, I will. By the way, can I keep the ownership? Can I sell it to all your competitors? And IBM famously said, sure, all that matters is the hardware. That's the same thing that's happening in this industry. And so I think our thesis is the power. There's going to be a lot of money made on the hardware side, but we think that that's ultimately going to be commoditized, where the margins are going to be low. Our belief is that where the power is, where the money is going to be made, where you're going to be able to make an impact, is on the software side, on having the data and the algorithms. And that's where we're playing. And I think in that particular sphere, we have a very nice first mover advantage, and at least the possibility for being able to be a dominant player in essentially owning the operating system for this emerging industry. With that said, like, those are great companies. I think, Elon Musk, and he's an incredible entrepreneur, obviously. He's got really, really exciting technology that he's building. And, it's an exciting arena to be in.
So really quickly, tell us exactly where in the product development cycle you guys are, and what's the next foreseeable product that we can start to see in the marketplace.
So we've beta tested a product in the sports world with golfers. We've beta tested a product with traders, both, with phenomenal success. Because we're making so much money in the trading space, we've put our sports thing on hold, although there's some activity there. Our focus for the next 12 months is getting traction with this trading platform. And we're beginning with a small group of clients. Our goal is maybe in the next year to have 100 traders wired up. But at the moment, it's looking like it's going to be generating phenomenal cash flow, building our data capabilities. And once we have a scalable platform, then I think we'll be able to get much larger in the financial services area and begin to enter other verticals as well. That's the quick answer. So we're kind of right at the point of product launch, but we have huge IP portfolio. We have a phenomenal leadership team, and I think really, really exciting and powerful technology.
All right. So the last question that we always ask is lessons learned. Any type of product or project failure, whether it's current or from the past, that you can share with others, and lessons that you can share, and things that you've learned personally.
Yeah, I unfortunately have a very long list of lessons I've learned. The one in the business world that I've learned the most is, given that I'm a guy who likes to bring technology into the market, is how important it is to make sure you're fulfilling a customer need. And, you hear about this all the time. But I think a classic mistake tech entrepreneurs make is you have technology that you think the market will want, that you think is added value. And as I've gotten older, as I've acquired battle scars, I've learned the most important thing when you launch a company is to begin with a customer in mind, to talk to the customer and say, not only are we fulfilling a need, but when you talk to them, that they are desperate for the solution. Because if you don't do that, it's very hard to generate the kind of revenue growth you need. And if you don't, then it's a kind of a really unpleasant thing. And so today, when I start a company, before I do anything, I run focus groups, I do market research, I talk to the customer, and I make sure if we come out with product X, which meets X need or Y need, that they're not only going to buy it, but they're going to be buying it ferociously. And that has proven to be, I think, a very successful and hard-won lesson.
Super great insight. And with that, I've been joined by Dr. David Bach, CEO of Optios. Thank you again.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.